Thank you for taking time away from your families and businesses during this challenging time to join us for this Epic Insight. This is Brian Lenz, Director of Sales and Strategic Partnerships here at Epic Retirement Plan Services, and I'll be your host for today's call. We're joined by DJ Tierney of Charles Schwab for a timely conversation about incorporating emotional and behavioral inputs from your clients into your practices. DJ is a senior client portfolio strategist supporting the Charles Schwab investment management arm, and in his role, he represents Schwab ETFs to sales channels, clients, and the media. He also works with Schwab's product management and marketing teams to produce educational and market strategy content for index products and ETFs. Your line will be muted throughout the call today, but if you have any questions that you want DJ and I to field towards the end, let us know and we'll be glad to do so. With that, we'll turn it over to DJ.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you to the whole RPS team for hosting us today, and thank you all for dialing in. As Brian said, we're in a pretty unique time right now, as a country, as a world. None of us are probably going through normal day-to-day behaviors or routines, so everything's a little out of whack. And also, there's a lot of probably more anxiety about the uncertainty that we're all facing together, which brings the topic at hand here really into focus. So Biagnostics, that term you see on your screen, that's a trademark program that Charles Schwab Investment Management has created to help advisors embrace and understand the impact that behavioral finance can have on investors and on investors' behaviors and outcomes. So the topic of behavioral finance has been around for a couple of decades. Our Chief Investment Officer, Omar Aguilar, has a doctorate in behavioral sciences from the Duke University. That, coupled with his 30 years of investment management, made him kind of uniquely suited to come up with this curriculum. I was lucky enough to be on a team that helped kind of refine the work he created 4 years ago and help create this deliverable that I'm presenting to you today. We've been giving this talk for a little over 2 years around the country. Just recently, we've had some more specific content that's been developed specifically for defined contribution and retirement planning space. So as a follow-up, there are retirement investment guides and an implementation guides recently developed that we're happy to share with you if the presentation resonates with you today and you would like some more information. So that's kind of the introduction. The idea is that this curriculum can provide you with language and processes and tools that'll help you connect with your clients at a deeper level, help understand what might be motivating them to be investors, to be saving for retirement, and really help them understand some of the biases that we as humans all carry with us that can often lead us to do suboptimal things as investors, as savers. So with that, why don't I move into the agenda? We'll talk about why behavioral finance is more important now, today, than really ever before. And it's not just the market that we're living, but it's the technology backdrop and the impact on technology in our lives. We'll talk about behavioral biases that come from inside us, the way we're wired, brain anatomy, as well as our experiential biases, things that we can observe across generations based on life experiences that give people certain predispositions and understanding. And then we'll talk about the program itself and what this is, what some of the worksheets can do for you, what some of the terminology and different ways that maybe you can implement this. And I find this rewarding. I find anyone that helps people save for the future and have better financial futures, what a rewarding way, to make a living. And so, if we can help you with this, this is really kind of in perfect alignment with the mission of Charles Schwab Investment Management. So we'll specifically talk about how you can tweak portfolios and maybe even make small adjustments to an investment allocation to acknowledge biases, make small compromises to lead to bigger long-term outcomes. I'll review some case studies, and then at the end, some tools and tips to get started, and then we'll field questions. So that's kind of the roadmap for how we'll spend our next half hour or so. So again, why do we do this? Really, the idea is that we're helping advisors get closer with their clients. We live in a world of increasingly important fiduciary responsibility where, the role of the advisor thankfully has migrated from somebody selling things to really looking out for investors' best interests. And that starts with proper asset allocation. But the idea of behavioral finance takes it further, not just the perfect asset allocation or ideal asset allocation, but what can we do in terms of coaching and counseling to help the investors stay with the plan for the long haul and maximize the outcome, maximize their savings behavior. So it's taking fiduciary responsibility to a different level. We're just trying to improve outcomes for investors in the long haul. And as an outcrop, you as an advisor, if you ever have angst about the value that you can add, we believe very firmly that the biggest value add an advisor can have is with this, with addressing behavior and optimizing investor behavior. We'll talk about the idea of asset allocation and even investment management perhaps becoming a little bit more commoditized, but the personal touch point in connecting with a client and helping them be a better investor is not something that can be commoditized, and we think it's a big value add. So let's talk about the current environment. I mentioned the impact of technology. What's happened in the last 30 years with computer technology, with internet technology, with smartphones and smart devices, it's transformed almost every industry in America. Travel agents is a real simple example. I like to ask when I give this in person for a show of hands, who's used a travel agent in the last year? And typically, if I've got 100 people in a room, I might get 10 hands that have used a travel agent. If you'd asked that question in the 1980s, you would have had an 80% hand raise because that was the way you booked travel 30 years ago. The number of independent travel agents in the United States numbered 35,000 in the late 1980s. That number today is closer to 10,000. So an industry that has been wholesale transformed, because now when you go to book your travel, what do? You go to Expedia or Priceline or Kayak or directly to the airliner and you book your own airline travel. You book your hotel very easily. So travel agents' roles have become much more specialized. The ones that are in business now have some kind of specialty niche. Tuscany travels in Italy with specialty knowledge on regions and inns that would be really difficult to find on the internet. So that's an example, but it's really the case for everything. And it's particularly important for investment management. There are offerings out there for robo-advisors where people can go on and fill out a quick questionnaire, have a portfolio arranged for them online, and a couple clicks, move the money in, invest it, and it completely can be done online. But is that truly advice? And so the idea of behavioral finance enables you to connect with them at a much different level than they could get on a smartphone. And, we'll talk about other industries like the media industry that's been completely transformed. But the point is, the ability to connect with clients and the focus, instead of asset allocation, stock picking having a specialty niche of certain total rate of return funds that you believe are better than others, maybe less likely to be the big value add than this, the ability to connect. And we think now more than ever, this is really going to be the differentiator for successful financial advisory practices. So I talked again, the return on time, if you go back 25 years ago, most advisors, even if you look at their marketing content, it was all about investment management. It was all about outcomes and advertising, returns, success stories, really, taking a certain amount of money and growing that money. And, what kind of experience your client had and, what their statements looked like, what their onboarding was like, that was kind of secondary, because if you were delivering returns and you were confident with that, that was your critical success factor as an advisor. Well, we think that's flipped upside down right now. And now advisors are realizing that if you start with the client experience and how they experience meeting your practice, interacting with your practice, getting information from your practice, that's actually probably the biggest contributor to them staying with you for the long haul. And getting things like operational excellence, onboarding, statements, access to information, very important. And investment management, while still a critical part of what we do as advisors, is probably third in the priority chain, whereas before it was the primary one. So really the whole business, this is a simple graphic of what the business has gone through in the last 2 decades. And so getting that client experience optimized is really going to be the most important part. So let's talk about what clients want and what clients need. And anyone that's served as an advisor and worked with investors for a long time knows that these are generally 2 distinct things. What do they want? Well, that depends. Some of them want absolute stability. They don't ever want to see a loss in their portfolio. They want a smooth ride. Others, they want 15% returns per annum for the next 2 decades. What they need, it generally is very different than that. And so the idea with Biagnostics is through a questionnaire, it'll validate what you maybe already know if you've got a good relationship. It's finding that common ground between what they want and what they need, and getting a portfolio that serves both. That serves what they emotionally came into your practice the very first time, marrying that with what they need. If they're 32 years old and they've got a retirement account and they want not to ever see a loss, but what they need is growth over the next 30 years, it's finding that middle ground where you can acknowledge, through diversification, through, maybe a larger allocation to fixed income than you might ordinarily at the margin, you acknowledge that want through communicating stability, but also give them the long-term appreciation that they need. So we'll talk a little bit more about how Biagnostics can do that. It's a framework to help them identify, maybe where some of their wants come from. And if they can even better understand themselves and understand, why it is they've got a certain predisposition, that's the first most important step in helping anyone overcome one, is just having the awareness. So there's been this kind of evolution on financial and investing theory. Prior to the 1950s, basically the whole field of financial planning, advice, analysis was all based on kind of Graham-Dodd fundamental investing, looking at balance sheets, income statements, and trying to find successful companies that were undervalued. That was traditional finance. Then in the 1950s, we get portfolio theory via Markowitz, which says, well, really, that security selection is important, but asset allocation through non-correlated assets is really where you want to be. And then in the 1990s, some groundbreaking work by some Nobel Prize laureates identified that, hey, you can have the greatest securities, you can have the greatest portfolio, but if you don't have the right behavior of your investor, in other words, if they don't bail out when the market goes down, and if they don't double up their buying every time the market goes up, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have a good outcome. So the role of investor behavior came to the forefront for the last 20 years. Now what we're noticing and what we have here in Biagnostics is an acknowledgement that it's not just the way they're wired in their brains, but it's also their experience. And we're seeing very clearly across some of the major generational cohorts, very different views on investing. So, and to put it even more focus on the social, the millennial generation are flocking very much towards ESG, environmental, social governance. They want to invest with impact, and they like to talk about their investing. Very different than a couple of generations ago, where nobody really ever spoke about their personal finances. Now, with this younger generation, you find them on social media, exchanging ideas, exchanging their portfolios, how much money they're saving, where it's going, much more open book. So that might be the forward looking, but we incorporate generational biases and experiential biases in Biagnostics in our curriculum now. So with that, let's get into a little bit more detail about where some of the biases come from. Firstly, here's a quote from Benjamin Graham. The investor's chief problem, even his worst enemy, is likely to be himself. And what's great about this quote is not just the quote itself, which acknowledges that we sometimes are all our own worst enemies, but it's who said it. Benjamin Graham was, the godfather of fundamental investing. He's the one that kind of came up with the Fundamental Investor book, came up with the whole idea of securities analysis. And at the end of his 50-year career as an academic and a successful investor, he came to the conclusion it's really about the investor temperament. And one of his most famous students was at the time a young man at Columbia University, Warren Buffett, who studied under Benjamin Graham. And Warren Buffett, if you ever go to Omaha, Nebraska for the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting, he starts off with a slide every year talking about a person of average intelligence can be a world-class investor, because it's actually not about intelligence, it's about having the right temperament, to be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. And he talks about how certain individuals are just wired uniquely to be good investors. So both Graham and Buffett kind of subscribe to this idea that what goes on in our heads and our composite makeup might be really important. So let's talk about the biases that come from inside us, the way we're wired. And it turns out that we are not wired to be successful investors. And so this is the only slide on brain anatomy. But if you took human biology in college, the part on the brain, there's usually this tri-brain model that says the human brain is comprised of 3 parts. 2 of them are represented on this slide. The third is the reptilian brain, which is right at the base of your brain stem from your nervous system. The reptilian brain controls things like heartbeat, breathing, sweat glands, things like that, real unconscious bodily functions. It's called the reptilian brain because if you took that part of the brain, if you dissected a human brain and you took that part out on its own, it looks just like the brain of a reptile, just like the brain of a fish, lizard, and even a dinosaur if you go way back. So the next part of the brain, and the three brain model, is the limbic system, and that sits on top of it. It's inside your brain. The interior part sits on top of the reptilian brain, and that controls instinct, reactive, and impulsive behavior. And on an evolutionary basis, we saw this emerge, 500 million years ago with the first mammals. So think mice, rats, squirrels, dogs, all have a limbic system, and they can learn. So if you think about a gopher poking his head out of his hole and taking a couple steps, if he sees a shadow cross overhead, he knows instinctively through learning, through he and his predecessors, that that's a sign of danger. So his heart rate increases and he darts underground and he digs into safety. So that's how the limbic system works, and it worked really well. It kept mammals alive and enabled them to live longer than their predecessors, the dinosaurs, right? Less reptiles now, more mammals. So the limbic system worked really well. Well, it turns out we all have that inside us. So, if you're on a hike in the forest and out of the corner of your eye, you see a little movement among the sticks and leaves, before you consciously think snake, your limbic system has already sensed danger. It's elevated your heart rate, and the fight or flight instinct takes over. And you have the ability at that moment to jump higher than you would in a normal scenario, because your limbic system floods your body with adrenaline and all sorts of things to get you ready for fight or flight. And it turns out that limbic system, we all have it. And guess what? Today, March 25th, 2020, our limbic system is working because we're dealing with anxiety and uncertainty. So, the U.S. population probably not sleeping quite as well. We're a little on edge, a little bit more emotion kind of at the forefront because we're dealing with uncertainty right now. So it can be a flash when you see something as danger, and it also can kind of be triggered by uncertain and unusual times. The last part of the human brain is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where we do our conscious thinking, reasoning. It controls language. This is the part of the brain that makes humans unique versus all other animals, because even though some of our cousins, apes and monkeys, have a prefrontal cortex, theirs is, a fraction of the size of ours. And so through evolution, humans have developed this giant prefrontal cortex. So up until the 1970s, 80s, and the work of behavioral finance, all investment theory, economic theory, was operating under the premise that the prefrontal cortex was really the focus, right? When I studied economics back in the 80s, economics is based on the idea that everybody is utility maximizing in their behavior. So in other words, we'll buy the car that makes the most sense for us, for our financial situation and our driving needs. We will, make financial decisions that are best for us for the future. Well, the fathers of behavioral finance, Dan Kahneman and Ivor Tversky, they kind of asked the question and said, have you gone outside and seen how the average human being acts? They don't act in a utilitarian maximum. They're making all sorts of illogical decisions. And so they realized that that limbic system in the core of our brain with the fight and flight is having a much bigger impact on how we make decisions. And this comes into play in investing. When you get worried about investment news, you want to act. You've got this embedded thing in your system that says, I have to act. And so, unfortunately, in volatile markets, it leads to people often selling into down markets at the wrong time and getting excited and greedy and buying when markets are appreciation. That's two general categorizations, but there's all sorts of other little shortcuts that's going on. It can come from the limbic system with fear, self-control, regret. It can also come from that from the cognitive part of your brain with these shortcuts like herding, availability, anchoring. So herding, I won't go through all of these, but herding is the idea. It's a cognitive shortcut. If you see a bunch of people successful, it's actually called herding. If you think a bunch of antelopes in a field, if they see some that are healthier, they'll start to mimic their behavior, and maybe they've got access to a better watering hole and a better source of food. So by sticking in a pack, you get comfort. Well, the way that works with investing, if you go back to the early 2000s, the entire U.S. population bought into one thought: buy as big a house as you can possibly afford, redecorate your house, because the more money you put into a house, the better off you'll be, because housing prices only go one way. Which way? Up. Right? Because we'd had about a 25-year run of housing prices appreciating, and everybody was doing it. And in fact, people were buying second houses, third houses, speculating in houses, right? You had cocktail waiters in Las Vegas owning 3 rental homes, because the more people did it, it led into price appreciation, and it really fed into a lot of the things that went into the financial crisis, because we had people overextending on home purchases, and that was the herding bias at play. So biases can span both feelings and thoughts. If you have one takeaway from today, I'll leave you this. If a client ever starts a statement to you with the 2 words, I feel, like, for example, recently, like, I feel like the COVID-19 virus is going to have a bigger impact on our economy, and so therefore I would like to take half my money out of the stock market in my retirement account. When they started with I feel, that's your big signal that it's coming from that limbic system deep inside. It's an emotional bias. And so when you have an emotional bias from an investor as an advisor, you can't talk to the prefrontal cortex, because that's not where the bias is coming from. So you could pull out your charts and graphs and say, oh, no, listen, here's previous pandemic data that would say that that's not going to happen. But you're using logic and you're trying to talk to the prefrontal cortex when the bias is coming from the limbic system. And so when you have an I feel bias from a client or a statement, you need to acknowledge it, counsel it, be patient, and know that it's going to be a different route to helping with that bias than simply using logic and data. And by contrast, if someone does say, hey, I read a report and look at these numbers, I would like to make this change to my portfolio, and they start with I think, or they cite data, then you know, okay, that's coming from the prefrontal cortex. I can use data on that. If they say they want to double up their exposure to banks, you could pull out their portfolio, do a portfolio analysis, and say, hey, did you know that 15% of your equity allocation is already in banks? You're there. You're already exposed. They might say, okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. I read a great Barron's article, right? So mapping a response to the source of a bias is really important. So I'll just briefly touch on the idea that, I talked about industries being transformed by technology. it's worth noting that right now in 2020, the whole media industry has been completely upended. Newspapers are going out of business, broadcast television, the two main sources that the baby boomers and the silent generation got their news from are going away. And so instead, we've got this online 24 hours a day, 7-day news cycle that pops up on your phone or your Apple Watch and is constantly pinging you with, hey, look at this. Hey, look at this. And what we're going through right now is obviously a very real crisis and a very significant macroeconomic event. But I could give you examples over the last 5 years of events that really, in retrospect, weren't that big, including Brexit at the time in 2015 when Brexit was blown up to being like the end of Western civilization. And we had, 10% swings in the U.S. equity markets on Brexit originally. And here we are now, 5 years later, it's slowly played out. And I think that the world has concluded that maybe it's not quite as big a deal as the UK leaving the European Union as it was made out to be. So acknowledging that your investors are dealing with more news exposure, more noise in the news, that's sensationalist by design to grab their attention, because the new media model only works if somebody clicks on a story. So they have to hit them with the headline. And when it comes to financial reporting, they are going to hit them with fear and greed nonstop. And if you Google stock market on any given day, you'll read scary stories. We're living it now, so I don't need to spend too much time on this. But if you go back over the last 5 years and look at, Brexit, the U.S. election cycle, tax breaks, the trade war, and the moves that we see at Schwab on our platform for collective retail investor flows, they map to these media stories. And so as an advisor, you've got a big job to do, and that is to downplay this daily, weekly, hourly commentary that your investors are being bombarded with. And so a big part of Biagnostics is really getting them to view the long term, because we're big believers, and most advisors are, that it's timing the market is impossible. There's no one that can predict these which days are going to be the up days and down days. Now, we're living in extreme market times the last few weeks. I've got return data here from 1999 to 2018. So over this 19-year period of time, the S&P 500 went up 5.6%. If you missed the top 10 days in the market over that 19-year period of time, your returns, annualized returns, go from 5.6 to 2%. So knowing when those 10 days are, I guess yesterday might be an example, right? Because I think we were up over 10% yesterday alone. So if anybody was feeling nervous and pulling money out of the market in the last 2 weeks and they missed yesterday, that's actually going to play out in their returns over the next 2 decades. It's hard to recover from missing an up 10% day. So if you miss the top 20 days, you're now out of positive returns into negative returns. So we think time in the market is much more important than timing the market. And another study, the Dowbar Study, looked at the investment returns of the average U.S. equity investor. So a couple thousand investors, they got their statements, and they looked at their returns. The average investor returns were 3.9%. If the investors had just put their money in the S&P 500 and held it for the 20 years, they got 5.6%. So 170 basis points left on the table, all attributed in the Dowbar study by timing, by those investors in that study tending to pull money off the table when markets were correcting and tending to add into markets when they're appreciating. So if we can cut back on that behavior and that timing that doesn't serve them well, you can deliver over 150 basis points of value right there. So I'll quickly talk about sociological biases. All the biases I've mentioned so far are the ones that come from in your brain, in your emotions, either the limbic system or the prefrontal cortex. Well, it turns out we're also impacted by our experiences. And the next slide, we conveniently put the entire U.S. population into 4 boxes: millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, and silent generation. And I'll say up front, you can't just categorize people into 4 boxes, because we're all very unique. And your experiences with where you first learned of investing, what your first investing experiences were like, who your role models were growing up, what you studied in college. All of that plays a role in how you view the markets, whether you're overconfident and you believe that you've got the ability to beat the market, to whether you're completely risk averse and you're really scared of the whole idea of investing. Like, everybody's on that spectrum in a different place. But what we can see, if we look at generations, and it's worth noting that where the money is, right? Most of the money is in baby boomers and silent generation hands, over 56% of mutual fund assets, but the money is moving down to the younger generations. So there's my generation, Gen X. I remember when that number said 25% a few years ago. So Gen X is either via inheritance or earning and saving, growing their piece of the pie. And Millennials, which is the largest cohort by population, I think the big number that industry consultants say is that there'll be $30 trillion passed down from the boomers and the silent generation to the millennials over the next 15 years. So knowing this generation and understanding that there's differences in the way these generations can view the market is worth acknowledging. And I'll say that if we look at what boomers know, and I'll make a stereotypical categorization here, that boomers tend to be risk embracing. They tend to, and this does show in the data, as they approach their retirement years, they want to stay over allocated to equities, even though their time horizons are changing as they enter retirement. Well, they should be risk embracing because look what they know. This is a generation that graduated from high school and college in the 1970s, just in time for what was going to be, a 20 to 30 year overall bull run in both equity and the housing market. So the bigger house they bought, the better they did in aggregate over that long time frame. And the stock market, while meandering and having some setbacks, 1987, still the biggest one-day correction in the market. What they learned from that was that within 2 years, the market would be back up again. So they were taught to believe in equities as a risk asset and buy on the dips. And now if you just look broadly at what millennials know, and this has only gotten worse in the last month, this is the generation that gets out of high school and is in college in time for the dot-com crash. So they see a 50% correction in the broad U.S. equity market, and that probably shakes them. And then the market recovers and has a 5-year bull run just in time for the financial crisis, where it goes down by more than half. And that's when they're entering the job market, right? They're impressionable years. When people are first starting to invest in their early 20s, this generation sees foreclosure signs in every neighborhood in the country. Statistically, one of their parents probably lost their job during the financial crisis. And so this is a generation that is very skeptical of the stock market, financial institutions, and equities. And what we're seeing is that as a cohort, they're over allocating towards cash and safe fixed income instruments in their retirement plans that have 30 years of time horizon left in them. And so your job, stereotypically with this cohort, is to help them see the long haul and embrace the biases that they have had ingrained through their life experiences. So I see I'm getting further into time, so I'll just go through that. We have this program, and the program is designed to help you diagnose, i.e., sit down with your investors, fill out a questionnaire, and have kind of provocative conversations to dig a little deeper into their experiences and their makeup and help them understand where their biases may lie. And then it's to make a plan. It's to talk specifically about things that they can do, whether it's automated savings program, a financial media diet, just agreeing not to spend time looking at their statements and looking at daily moves. And then you implement the plan. You might actually make small tweaks to their portfolio. Maybe if you're fortunate, big tweaks if they're underallocated. If it's the millennial that's got 70% of his 401k in fixed income, maybe you're able to make wholesale implementation changes at that point. And then you communicate what you've done. And then the next time you meet, you diagnose again. So you get kind of in this value add loop with them where you're utilizing these ideas to connect with them and help them understand and get to a better place. So again, you can use what you've learned in Biagnostics to make bias optimized portfolios. So it may not be the exact portfolio that their demographic earning data might suggest. Maybe you make tweaks at the margin, plus or minus 5% to different risk buckets to acknowledge their biases. And while you might not have the perfect optimal long-term outcome, the chances of them staying with it go up materially. So I mentioned we have, here's some ideas of some examples of advisor guide, investor guide, and client action plans. We have specific curriculum now around defined contribution and retirement savings. And so there is there's an investor guide, which is something that you would review with your investor, as well as an advisor guide for you to kind of read a little bit more on a lot of the topics that I've quickly covered here today. They're reinforced, the languages and definitions are all in there. So I kind of feel like I gave a little bit of the boomer millennial examples as I was going through, but here's Judy, a baby boomer client. You know, Judy, by the fact that she's 63 years old and is 2 years from retirement, has a net worth of $1.6 million. What she wants is to be a risk seeker because she's very comfortable with the equity markets, and she wants to have, you know, a 75, 80% allocation to equities. But what you know as an advisor, if you look at the data and if you did, you know, optimal asset allocation for her age, you would know her equity allocation really should be in this 35, 65%. Because if we were to have, say, a 30% market correction, like we just did, she may not have the time to get that back, right? It might be a while before we get all of this recovered back, plus the appreciation that she is seeking. So she would have been in a much better place. And so the idea is that you help her find her place by going through this and helping her identify along with you biases that she might have that got her there. So same. You go through, you identify them, and it gives you suggestions on triggers and freedom factors that you can embrace to get to a better place with them. So the idea is that maybe, you know, you're able to get Judy where she was 80%. If you can get her down to 65, 60, 50%, you get her to a much better place for a better long-term outcome. And with the program, you get her buy-in too. You're not just making the abrupt change. You're going through a process with her where she understands, you know, where her risk embracement came from, but you can both counsel and use data to get her to a better place. So another example from a millennial, which I kind of gave to you, where you've got a millennial who wants to be conservative. They've only got 25% in the equity market, even though they've got a 40-year time horizon towards retirement. And so using Biagnostics can help diagnose them, get their buy-in, and communicate with them to get to a better place. So ideas there on how to use it. You know, we have advisors that use this the first time they meet a client at the Intech meeting. We've had advisors start to use this even when they're being interviewed for the first time. It can be a differentiator because it's a whole different set of questions than a typical advisor or retirement planner might ask. We have some that'll use it at their annual review meetings. Some have market volatility SOS plans that are probably being utilized right now where this topic comes up. We've also had clients introduce the topic at client appreciation events, or they host workshops where they kind of introduce it and then engage them on one-offs after that. So hopefully that was enough for you to find it useful. You know, we're finding that it's actually having results. We're finding advisors are giving us feedback that they're connecting with their clients and their retention rates are going up. So we're hoping that you find this useful. And as a follow-up, you know, you can certainly go to Chris and Brian, and they will be they'll have the information to get you this Biagnostics investor guide and advisor guide as a follow-up. And with that, why don't we open it up to questions, Brian?
Yeah, thanks, DJ. That was a kind of a great primer for the program. For those of you who do have questions for DJ, feel free to enter those into the GoToWebinar questions panel right now, and I'll field them. DJ, one that came in already is, obviously you have a nice program here, and it looks very robust. You kind of gave one shortcut in your presentation, which was being cued into someone saying, I feel, as a trigger for that being a more emotional decision, obviously. Are there any other nuggets from the program that might be particularly applicable right now that an advisor could use in light of the pretty extreme circumstances that are going on, and, maybe not being able to get all their clients to sit down and go through this right away? Are there things that are actionable right now for an advisor who gets a call from a panicked client in 30 minutes from now? I know there's
Right.
no
So,
magic bullet, but are there some things you can take from this to share right now?
yeah. Yeah. So I would. And I'm, being a financial professional for 25 years, I'm not a investment advisor, but I am getting phone calls right now. Like my older sister called me last week and said, "Oh my gosh, what should I be doing?" My childhood best friend's mother called me, who's got significant assets, who has an advisor, but said, "DJ, can I just talk to you about what's going on here? Should I be making a move here?" And so I'm certain that you're all getting these calls. And so the biggest takeaway would be, listen, we're all in this together. We're all having these feelings right now, but acknowledge that what you're feeling right now is the need to do something, and that is a natural reaction as a human being, but it is generally not the right course of action for optimal long-term outcomes. So if you can disconnect their feeling and the idea that they want to act with what is probably in their best interest, which is to stay with a long-term plan, presuming they have one, and presuming that they are allocated somewhat logically, it's just not the time to be reactive, right? And one more story. My brother, we lost our parents last year, so my parents' modest assets are in a trust, and they haven't been distributed. So my brother called last week and said, "Hey, let's put this money in the market. This seems like an opportunity." And when he called, I think at that point equities had corrected about 20%. And he and I are co-trustees. And I said, hey, Matt, I'm just, this isn't the time to make moves. We don't know. I don't know what the next week, but it's a relatively conservative. We have them in a relatively conservative portfolio until this is all worked out and we've got the life insurance. Probably let's just let this sit. I don't think acting in the midst of this market volatility is the right thing for our siblings, right? So that I would just say, if I could give you one thing, it's this is not, when emotions are at play and anxiety is high, it's not the right time to make wholesale changes to any investment. And if you can take that away, hopefully that'll be impactful.
Great. No, I appreciate those anecdotes. And thanks again to DJ and Charles Schwab Investment Management, and in light of everyone's time, and to make sure you're spending as much of it with clients as you can, we'll let you go for the day and appreciate you joining us. We wish you all safety and health as you support your families, colleagues, and clients. And please don't hesitate to contact us at Epic RPS if there's anything we can do to support you at this time. So thanks again to all, and stay safe.